you probably are going to see, six-figure deals done without any human interaction. I do think those types of sales will start to go the way of having agents talking to customers, doing a lot of that. And I also think you're just going to see like a difference in how the products are done. People that start using Clay actually send fewer emails than you did before. And so the real secret is targeting. So can you find like the right person with the right pitch at the right time? Go-to-market engineers are kind of following software engineers, maybe a year, 18 months behind where they are in terms of how they're using LLMs.
Welcome to Dry Run Everett.
Thanks so much, Ashita. Super happy to be here.
So you lead go-to-market engineering over at Clay. You also helped pioneer the role, which has now become something that it seems like everyone is trying to hire for. You're also an engineer and a founder. So to start, could you give us an overview of how you went from being an engineer to a founder to now focusing on go-to-market?
Yeah, so I started a company right out of university with some friends. We were building like computer vision software. So we were trying to solve the problem of tracking people in a physical space across like multiple cameras, which at the time was like a pretty hard problem. And we were kind of building this Amazon Go type thing where you could like go into a store and like shop and then like leave without, checking out and stuff. And so we worked on that for several years, like 4 or 5 years. And then during COVID, we like lost all of our retail pilots. And we also kind of didn't know anything about business or go to market. And if we had, we probably would have realized that like the market we were selling into was very tough to crack. And like the business probably wasn't ultimately that scalable.
Yeah.
So I had moved to San Francisco to raise money for that. And I had met a founder whose tool I was using. It was called Archetype. It was like an SQL tool. And so I still wanted to do kind of like technical work, but I wanted to learn more about basically how to properly, do sales and marketing. And so I joined his company as like the first growth hire. And then that company scaled pretty well. We had tons of like active users, but we didn't ever fully get to the place of monetizing it. And then it was acquired by ClickHouse. And so from there, I had like moved to New York at some time between that and was trying to get this other guy, Schechter, who's the co-founder of a company called Vantage. He had this amazing site, which was like, if you searched like AWS pricing, you would always hit this site. So it generated like tons and tons of SEO traffic for his tool, which was a cloud cost management tool. And so I was like, I love this play. And we started talking, and then I joined Vantage to lead marketing there. And like a little while into Vantage, I found Clay at this kind of like Brooklyn meetup thing. And I realized we could run all these like really advanced plays on Clay. And one of them that worked super well for us was we would kind of like scan GitHub and enrich the people that were starring like really popular open source projects like Kubernetes and stuff. And then Vantage had a Kubernetes cost management solution. And so I used Clay to kind of like find those engineers, find those engineering leaders, and then email them about, hey, like, since I know you're using Kubernetes, we have a solution to help you like control costs for that. And that play was like insane. It kind of really opened my eyes to what was possible because when I was using Clay, I didn't really feel like I was, launching campaigns. It felt more like programming. And so I got super into Clay, and I actually didn't know he was the founder, but I was always pinging Varun, and I was like, hey, I need more credits. Like I need like a sales loft connector. I need all these things. And eventually Varun was like, hey, we should get coffee. And I was like, great. Like I have so many feature requests and like bugs and complaints and stuff. But that conversation turned into actually like, hey, like I'm Clay at the time was a self-serve business. So you'd put a credit card in and kind of like agree to the terms and everything. And Varun wanted to build more of like a sales-led motion and sell Clay to larger companies. And so he was like, he was like, okay, you've never done sales before. You've like barely even like done like marketing, but since you know the product really well, the main challenge is to kind of like build these sort of like programmatic growth plays for these larger companies. And so I joined Clay in April of 2024 to do that. And we called the role GTM Engineering because it really was like sort of like hands on keyboard, implementing stuff. And then that like, it was still a surprise to me how much people really like vibed with that approach. And there were a bunch of things that Clay got right from like a product standpoint that were just pains within the space. Like, just data enrichment turned out to be a massive problem at all these big companies. And so we scaled that go-to-market engineering team and to the point where it was like, wow, we have a real sales motion now. And then towards the end of last year, it was like, all right, fork in the road. Like, do you want to kind of like learn what it takes to be like a real sales leader of like a large team?
Yeah.
So I handed the reins off to this amazing person, Becca Lindquist, who like leads our global sales org now. And now I'm more of like just like a kind of GTM engineer,
Oh,
like at Clay. It's sort of one of those like hindsight is 2020 things where it's like, okay, the convergence of like growth and engineering
yeah.
and being a technical person, but like being interested in go to market,
Yeah.
that sort of resulted in like a great spot.
Yeah. That's really interesting. So you kind of described how the role kind of formed around Clay, the product, but how did the industry kind of follow suit? And was it because you guys were really out there doing education, content, or like what was the path to like everyone getting excited about go-to-market engineering?
Basically, the like 5 to 10 years ago, the way that everybody was doing sales was you buy a lead list from a single data provider, and these companies, like, still exist, and many of them are integrated into Clay, and then you give your sales reps a kind of, like, standard interface where they can, source contacts and decide to sequence people and reach out to them,
Hmm.
and what was happening is first of all, every company has a very unique go-to-market motion. Like it's kind of like a snowflake situation where you can't really build something that is the same for everybody. And if you do that, everybody ends up running the same plays, and it's sort of the effectiveness of all those plays goes to zero, basically. And so companies were then adding all these like bespoke tools into their rep workflows. So then a sales rep to sequence like one contact, reach out to one person, they would like start in Sales Nav and then use the Zoom Info Chrome extension and then check Salesforce and then check on and then sequence it in Outreach and then like go to their dialer. So like the workflow started taking place across like 7 or 8 browser tabs. And then when you do that, of course, your sales reps have different like skills. So some of them are really good, some of them are, not as good at the prospecting, good at other things, or some of them are just not that good. And so you get this like highly varied quality of like customer experience that you're delivering. And so that's sort of on the rep side. And then on the data side, the fact that you're getting data from one source actually means that you're usually not getting all the data that you need. So
Yeah.
sort of two trends kind of started happening, which I think Clay was really a pioneer to kind of our founders and our product team's credit on. One was on this like rep workflow side, they pulled a lot of those things into more of a centralized function where like an operations person or who we now call a GTM engineer would orchestrate all of that. So the rep would kind of wake up with like a pre-written message to a contact that was like of high quality and like was of a standard high quality across the team. And then secondly, there's a technique called waterfalling where instead of checking each data provider for like a contact, you check like 5 or 10 of them at the same time. And in doing that, you get kind of like full coverage across everybody's database. So Clay, in my opinion, pioneered both of those things. And the fact that it needed to be done in like a centralized way and the fact that it needed to be kind of engineered, like which data provider are we calling and which systems are we connected to, that gave rise to the go-to-market engineer role.
That's really interesting. And for you as a former engineer, what about go-to-market engineering? Because the engineering component is very large, and I feel like people don't realize it.
Yeah.
They kind of think of it as just like a more of like a sales role, which it kind of is a hybrid. But you as an engineer, what's the interesting engineering problem with go-to-market?
Yeah, so like the real go-to-market engineers aren't customer facing. Clay, we sort of have like
Mhm.
diluted the definition by accident a little bit because we hired all these people that were like they had operations and growth experience, so they could go into our customers and like set this up for them. But at every other company besides Clay, the go-to-market engineer is like an internal role that is focused on basically like pipeline generation and like building these systems. And go-to-market itself has just become, at least at a lot of companies that I work with, pretty technical. Especially with the rise of LLMs, you can take this like, giant call transcript and just like pull out all the information, or you can take, a long email thread and summarize it. And so a go-to-market engineer today is like sitting inside a company, stringing together multiple data sources, applying LLMs on top of that. And then we at Clay kind of have a vision of go-to-market engineers now are building these loops where you kind of get all your data together, you let agents reason about what should happen next, and then you like execute on that. You send a message or notify someone, and then you kind of see what happened and loop back and like do that again and again. And so now like go-to-market engineers are kind of following software engineers maybe a year, 18 months behind where they are in terms of
Yeah.
how they're using LLMs. And so yeah, that is like a pretty technical exercise. And of course, not every company is going to be, as deep in the weeds on that. And so at Clay, we are basically building more mass market tools that provide the software that does a lot of those steps. And then you still need someone that is sort of knows what they're doing, but they don't have to like design everything. They can kind of like use Clay to build those pieces and stitch them together in a good way. So yeah, and I think companies, because you can now build like a completely custom go-to-market motion and you can really just like fit it to what your product does and how you go to market. Companies have really embraced that because that uniqueness is how they kind of gain an edge against competitors and so forth.
So for companies that are farther along in developing their sales organizations, if they're implementing go-to-market engineering as a practice, are they taking their salespeople and training them, or is it more like taking their software engineers and data engineers and
It usually comes from the operations side. So behind there's like a third party between engineers and salespeople, which is like sales ops, rev ops, marketing ops.
Mm,
In the beginning with Clay, we did hire these folks that were like a BDR with a computer science degree. And so you will have people in these sales orgs that can kind of like move over, but it's usually more common to see someone in operations kind of evolve into the role.
yeah.
And then definitely at companies like Vercel or Cognition or Ramp, you actually do see software engineers kind of moving over into go to market and building these things. In a lot of cases, they might even be sort of like, coding some of these systems as well. And so, but what we kind of see is like most companies aren't taking it that far. Most companies are kind of like still trying to use tooling or some good primitives like we try to build with Clay to like give those to people that know go to market and let them sort of build the same thing.
Yeah. So if you were to go out and start a company now, at what point would you even think about like implementing go-to-market engineering? Is it at some point where you have enough data or a certain point where you've hit PMF?
You generally want some inkling of PMF. Like at the earliest stages, having a go-to-market engineer can be super helpful because you can run tons of experiments.
Yeah.
But I generally think like you'd probably have a few salespeople in place, which probably means that you can sort of like, feed their mouths. So you can kind of say, hey, like I'm gonna hire you and I know that you can go out and sell at least like $1 million a year of product. And you want a few of them so you can kind of like do things. So that means that a company generally has like a few $1 million of revenue and has kind of progressed past the stage where like the founder is joining every call and the product is changing a lot and things like that. So I kind of see it as like a Series A and beyond thing. That said, there is one particularly important thing that is important to get right early, which is I call it the golden list,
Mm.
which is like the list of target companies where if you magically got an intro to any one of them, you would be like super psyched. But actually building that list properly and getting all the contacts in and updating it all the time is like not that simple, but still like it's kind of something that the founder or the CTO could kind of figure out and you might operationalize it later with a go-to-market engineer.
So go-to-market engineering, and this is definitely enabled by LLMs too, has made it so that people can do a lot more. A lot more means people can do more outreach. And one of the things that is now made possible is people can do cold outreach at scale.
Yeah.
And once this happens and becomes a norm, which I think is kind of happening, buyers are just left with really full
Yes,
inboxes.
that's right.
So, how are teams that are doing this well keeping themselves kind of memorable or like not drowning in this like trap of like doing a little too much outreach in the wrong way?
Yeah. It's still important to kind of land relevant messaging in the right person's inbox. And like usually what we find is people that start using Clay actually send fewer emails than you did before. And so the real secret is targeting. So can you find like the right person with the right pitch at the right time? And so actually like most of the work in Clay is not the message itself, but it's this sort of like signals and filtering and scoring that happens
Mhm.
before you actually execute the message. We find that it's still true that if you actually reach someone in that right moment, you get responses and you get meetings booked. What doesn't work is just to kind of like blanket the market in your messaging, especially if it's kind of the same messaging. And like one kind of test for this is, can you run a program like this from your main inbox? You know, if you do end up blanketing the market in this stuff, like the email filters respond to this and they kind of like degrade your domain. And so like a real test if you're doing this well is if obviously you're getting responses in meetings, but then you're also able to kind of like do this at a reasonable volume from your main domain. The other strategy, which is more mass market, is more what I'd call like almost like outbound marketing, where either A, you're like searching for signals. So you're just going to email like a broad swath of people and kind of really understand like who's responding and stuff like that. And that's going to help you do your actual sales outreach, or you're just kind of like almost in a newsletter fashion trying to make people like more aware of your product. And there's been a number of companies that have been really successful with that. Like Ramp and Rippling, I think, are two companies that really did actually do like mass market outbound. And because their product is so horizontal, so necessary for every company, you do you can be effective with that. But if I was selling like, like software for like CFOs at healthcare companies, like that is a situation where it's more about the targeting and the signals than it is about like emailing every CFO.
As you've mentioned that Clay is a user of Clay as well, what is maybe something, maybe a play or emotion recently that you found by being a user of the product yourself that maybe you wouldn't have if you weren't? Uh,
One that I was like thrilled to be a part of is our co-founder Varun took me to the Masters this year, which is like amazing because I'm a huge golf fan and I
Yeah.
play golf, and I was like expecting to never go to the Masters in my life because it's pretty
Yeah.
hard to go. So that was like insane. But then we had this idea. It was actually Varun's idea because he's sort of the original like growth. Like he has amazing ideas. So because the Masters is hard to go to, they do a lot of things to make it like very premium. So for example, you can only buy Masters swag at Augusta at the Masters. So we bought like several $1,000s worth of swag. And then we were like, okay, we're gonna send this to all of our prospects, like CROs who are golf fans. But you can't just be like, search in sales nav and be like, oh, do they like golf or not? Right. So we kind of built some tables, which, first of all, we looked at like, okay, like people that live in New York, they might like golf, but it's hard to play golf in New York.
Yeah.
Right. So we looked for people that kind of lived in metro areas where there was accessible golf courses. We looked for kind of like, your like 40s to 50s, like man, right, is kind of narrowing in on like who would be potentially a golf fan. And then we use Clay to find out like all the addresses of these companies. And then we actually kind of like hooked into the USPS API to like execute the like sending of the swag package and like make sure that we knew like when the package was going to arrive. And then we kind of wrote these like handwritten letters to these, 100 or so CROs. And and so the like targeting and like execution of that campaign was all done in Clay. And that was like one of our most successful campaigns ever. I think we got like a 60%
Wow.
bookings out of that. But it was only 100 people, only 100 leadership people. But it was a very unique creative idea, and it needed this kind of unique data set and execution mode. And so that's the kind of thing that Clay is like at its best, like really useful for. Of course, it also does all these kind of like solves these data engineering problems and data enrichment. But that's the type of thing that you can like really only build in Clay as far as I
Yeah.
know.
That's so good. That's a really great example. So we've talked a lot about go-to-market engineering and various ways that different companies and even Clay execute on it. So part of go-to-market engineering is the data part. And so this function should then theoretically be important to any company that touches customers and data. But today we kind of see a lot of success stories around like your typical like B2B SaaS. How can go-to-market engineering impact other industries outside of tech?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot actually because I've been working on sort of our like new verticals at Clay. So I've actually later today I'm like meeting with a bank and stuff, and so the there's kind of some pre-work that these other industries are needing to do and are doing, which is to begin to operate their go-to-market the way that technology companies do.
Mhm.
So it's kind of easy to forget, and I'm guilty of this too, that like the tech industry has gone through probably two or three different phases of doing demand gen where they have, go-to-market engineering is almost a response to demand gen programs that involve like AEs and SDRs sending sequences using Zoom Info and Outreach and stuff, and like problems that arose with that and new things people wanted to do from that. But other industries aren't even at that stage of like doing demand gen. So what is happening though is it's kind of like how in Africa, basically people just went straight to cell phones. They didn't install like landlines everywhere. What we are seeing is companies in like, real estate, insurance, and banking, like they are wanting to take their either like their broker teams or their sales teams at whatever version that industry has and bring them up to speed to do this thing. And of course, like a lot of these companies don't necessarily even have like big operations teams that support their sales teams, especially if it's a broker business. So what is happening is these industries are evolving their kind of org structure to like do this. And then they are saying, okay, like what are the kind of AI GTM tools that we can use to attack this problem? So it's kind of a two-phase thing where there's like a groundswell of, hey, let's do modern go-to-market first. And part of our job is to actually, in some ways, convince companies to do that. And then it's like, okay, let's apply the modern tooling that other people have to kind of get up to speed. And so those two things kind of need to be true. We have a large like waste recycling company that's a customer. And what they do is they use satellite imagery to look at the colors of the dumpsters outside different like retail businesses. And their dumpsters are a certain color, and other companies' dumpsters are different colors. And so, when they see a dumpster that's not their color, they know that that's like a potential prospect, and they like send direct mail to that business. So like bit by bit, I think we're going to see other companies and other industries adopt these techniques. It's going to be similar to, I think, how other industries eventually adopted the cloud.
Yeah.
And you still, in fact, have kind of very legacy businesses that are not even on the cloud yet. And so there's, AWS and everybody is like working to get those people on the cloud. Go to market techniques, number one, and then go to market like tooling and kind of GTM engineering, number two, are going to, I think, follow that same path.
Yeah. That's really interesting. And from your vantage point, maybe like focusing back on more tech companies, since you've been a founder and now you see go to market from various angles, what are some mistakes that you see founders or companies make when they're just establishing their go to market practice?
Yeah, well, not having the actual list of ICP accounts and contacts at a very early stage is one of them. Companies like I like to sometimes test founders and be like, send me a list right now of like 50 companies that you would love an intro to. Or, hey, let's do dinner next week. Let's get like 20 executives on the dinner table. Like, who are those 20 people? A lot of like very early stage founders might not really be able to tell you that. And so that is the first mistake, is not actually having a kind of solid market map early enough and being able to, update that and have the right contacts. Then later on, I do think a lot of founders have kind of been like brainwashed of this thing of like, hey, you have to join sales calls. I actually think that the real test of scale is how early in your journey can the founder stop joining sales calls? Majority of them, like obviously you still want to talk with, Fortune 500 CEOs or whatever, whatever. And actually like let your go to market practice like begin to scale.
Yeah.
I actually was guilty of this at Clay too. I spent far too long sort of personally involving myself in like all these deals, and it actually ends up holding back the team a little bit. And you don't discover problems where there's some like unique knowledge that you as the founder or like an early GTM leader have that you haven't actually enabled your team on, or like some process you follow or some like trick you use in sales calls to like, get people really excited. And so it's important to sort of pressure test that ability to scale and that ability to basically like not join these calls and so on. And then so that kind of takes you from like seed to series A to series B. Then the first sales leader hire is like super important. Have I think a lot of people have had experiences where you have sort of these different phases of the company, and each time you have this like turnover of the bench that happens, where like a new sales leader comes in and they sort of do things at a new scale that means that the OGs of the company like don't really fit in. I think it's really important to kind of manage that and not necessarily hire people that are just going to take their playbook and like put it in your company. You kind of want people that have a playbook and you can talk to them about that, but you can really interrogate like what's going to be different this time and like what do you want to change? And it's almost more the knowledge of like how to build a playbook and implement it that's important versus like, hey, do you have a playbook that you can just, you know, fit into my org. So those mistakes occur across like three different stages of the company. But if you can dance around those, you can sort of create this like smooth go to market, revenue increase, and you'll be much happier.
So, speaking of sales organizations, there's been discourse around how much of sales to automate. Like people talk about having a fleet of autonomous SDRs, for
Yeah.
example, like run their company. Where do you land on this conversation? And what would need to happen with agents' capability for you to feel comfortable handing off sales processes?
Yeah, to me, this is kind of like the same, like counterintuitive thing of how math and coding has been the first thing to be automated
Mhm.
with the rise of LLMs versus like, necessarily like marketing or sales. And so at the highest level, at the enterprise sales level, you're, I think, never going to kill that relationship aspect of doing the sale. But what ends up happening is a account team for a large customer ends up comprising not only the person that has all the relationships with the execs and everything, but you have like all this technical support and solution support and product support and all of that. And you have sort of a lot of just back office things that are happening to try to support the customer, to sell to them, to expand them, to retain them, etc. So I actually think it's all that back office stuff and that is going to be sort of like the first domino to fall.
Mhm.
And so like with when you're within the sales process, like questions about like how does the product work? Like, can it do what I need? Can it build like a POC or a demo that is, tailored to this account? Those things I think will be actually covered by agents and done by agents. And the salesperson will be able to kind of maybe, instead of supporting one Fortune 500 customer, they can support like four Fortune 500 customers. And they have teams of agents that are helping them do all of that stuff. And then they're sort of like coordinating with those agents and joining calls. And obviously, I still think there's going to be like some level of technical knowledge that is going to be helpful to kind of steer your agents. But I don't necessarily think it like the salesperson is the actual kind of like at least the enterprise level target. It's like the support
Mhm.
around them. So that's at the top end of the market. Then when you go down, I actually do think like transactional sales I mean, I think we're going to be surprised. Like you probably are going to see, six-figure deals done without any human interaction. I do think those types of sales will start to go the way of having agents talking to customers, doing a lot of that. And I also think you're just going to see like a difference in how the products are done. Like
Mhm.
if we're moving to this world where a lot of it is consumption based and a lot of it is like, there's less UIs, there's more MCP servers or skills or APIs. People that are using agents at companies are going to have a situation where their agents are discovering what they need to buy and what they need to use in order to accomplish a task. And those agents might end up dialoguing with agents at the vendor company in order to like facilitate a transaction and get things going. And so I think at the bottom end of the market, you're going to see both like product changes where this, fill out a contact form, talk to an SMB sales rep thing that starts to go away and you start to just agentically interact directly with the product through purchasing it, but also using it in whatever you're doing. And then there's still going to be some element of transactional sales that occur, but I think those are actually going to be facilitated by agents. And then at the top end of the market, it's going to be the supporting functions around the like relationship holder that end up like falling first. So that's my take for the time being.
No, that makes sense. And so if you were a go-to-market engineer, if you're thinking about things that you talked about would potentially get automated away, how would you think about your role?
So go-to-market engineers are going to be building these like go-to-market loops, I think. So they're going to be sitting within these companies, like steering agents that are, for example, doing those SMB transactions or supporting those enterprise reps. And they're going to be sort of like designing the system that like controls all of that. And and so actually the go-to-market engineer I think is in a great position because one reason the role has grown so much is as new models come out and more capabilities come out from those models, go-to-market engineers gain leverage. And so the role is almost like an index on increasing AI capabilities. And and so functions that were done by, other roles and stuff are kind of being subsumed into these agents and go-to-market engineers are sitting there like steering all of that and orchestrating all of that. So I think the main thing for go-to-market engineers is just to make sure that they're continuing to push the capabilities of what these systems can do as applied to go-to-market, and making sure that, when Mythos class models become broadly available, you can do things like create a long-running loop that actually books a meeting. I mean, I think that's actually a really hard task, but the act of designing that and putting all the pieces in place that you need to do that, whether or not you eventually get the loop working or not, will end up benefiting the company like tremendously.
Yeah. So to wrap up, you've been at Clay now over 2 years. It feels like things are changing so often, just given the environment's changing. There's so many things in AI, so many new types of companies popping up. But how are you kind of thinking about your role and where Clay is going to take things?
Well, I'm definitely excited about these GTM loops and self improving revenue systems, but on a ground level, the availability of Clay's MCP and API has meant that we have sort of a new set of personas that can use us. And those people are people that are living in like Claude or Codex or chatting with their things. And a lot of those folks are like GTM leaders and individual sales reps and people that, we're never going to click into Clay's UI and like configure the Salesforce lookup and stuff like that. But now it's not necessary anymore. And in fact, you don't even need to know anything about Clay. I have our team now like doing this one thing where they have all of their team's calendars connected to Claude, and they can go in and just like talk to their team schedule like every week. So as a sales leader, this is really helpful because you can now say like, all right, pull up all my team's meetings. Let's find out how big are these companies? What's the like deal context on these companies? And who's the most senior leader that's joining the call? And you can kind of inspect all the calendars and say, okay, there's like a VP of RevOps at this 5,000 person company on Wednesday at 2 p.m. joining this call. I'm going to join that call as well to like support my team and be like a leader on that team. And that's like one use case. The leader can also say like, hey, like how many meetings have we booked? Who's booking outbound versus inbound? How full of our the calendars? Like how productive are we being? And so it's all these questions that traditionally a go-to-market leader would be asking their ops team, and they would like, okay, like let me get a Salesforce report going, and like give you a spreadsheet, and we'll have a meeting in like 3 days to talk about it. And now it's like I can just sit there on Sunday night and like dialogue with my team's schedule, my Salesforce data, my enriched data in Clay, and like figure all this stuff out. And so I've been like super enthusiastic about seeing our teams doing that. And it's one of those things where like once you get it going, everybody loves it. But
Yeah.
the actual like steps to sort of set everything up and connect everything and provide people with that chat environment are not so straightforward. So yeah, on the vision level, the GTM loop I think is great, and then on the surface level, just like these personas that used to be kind of locked out of Clay, but now can
Yeah.
use Clay's data through a chat interface, I think is amazing.
Yeah. That's awesome. Well, thank you again for joining us.
You're welcome.